Tell me when. Got it. So I'm really, really excited to introduce Rabbi Dr. Joshua Cahan. He's a writer and educator, and he's an old friend of mine from the rabbinics and prayer education world. And really, even before that, I met him at Camp Ramah when he was working there, and I think I was visiting. Rabbi Cahan received his rabbinic ordination and his PhD in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He served as a Jewish day school senior educator for many years and also spent 8 years as director of the Northwoods Kollel and Beit Midrash at Camp Ramah in Wisconsin. He compiled and edited the Yedid Nefesh Bencher, which is a terrific bencher, and his new Pesach Haggadah is coming out this spring. In addition to this 2-part series, he will also be in person with us as our scholar in residence in December 2023. I know him as a wonderful teacher. We have had many engaging conversations about the philosophy of teaching Talmud, teaching prayer, some of the mechanics and the specifics. And every time I just feel so alive with interest in what goes on in his mind and his excitement about sharing and connecting us to text, connecting people to text. So I was super happy when he reached out to me, and we talked about doing this series. And I think that what he plans to cover with us will really be right on for us. It's well, you'll see. Let's let him take it from here. Just so glad that you're all here. And again, we love to see faces. If you're able to show a face, if you're not, we understand. If you're wearing pajamas, we don't care. All right.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor. I'm so excited. I'm actually going to be doing numbers of these sessions kind of leading up to Pesach, but this is kind of my first one. So so this is actually fun opportunity for me. I do want to apologize for getting you thinking about Pesach even before Purim. I know that feels a little sort of disorienting, but I hope that in this session and the next session, I'll give you some new framing to think about both the holiday of Pesach and the ritual of the Seder, and what that ritual is about and what it's supposed to be like, and what's for, and the Haggadah as a book of liturgy. And we talk about, well, what Haggadah do you use? And we kind of associate, like, we almost equate what book, which version, what Haggadah to use with the actual text of the Haggadah, which is not something like we don't do with, well, what Siddur do you use to daven, is separate from the liturgy of the morning service, right? We know those two are separate, but we don't separate a book from the actual liturgy, the text, the traditional text of the Haggadah, in the same way. I also want to say, coming after a day after the this kind of declared day of hate, which I was less struck by sort of drawn to any particular kind of events that, or sort of expressions that happened in the course of yesterday. I'm not even sure I've heard much about many meaningful things, but the way that we as a community kind of like breathlessly kind of react to those kinds of sort of perceived threats, and how we kind of situate and think of ourselves and where we're at in the world and where we're at in the present moment, I think is very connected to what it is that we're supposed to remember at the Seder. So that's by way of kind of general introduction. One other piece. So I've been working on editing a new Haggadah. It's kind of modeled on the idea of the bencher, for those of you who are familiar with it. In the next session, I will kind of share the PDF, and we'll actually look at some of the pages, and we'll talk about sort of the challenges of designing a book for ritual use a little bit. But in the process, I've gotten to re-engage with this liturgical text in a really new way, and a way that I found surprisingly exciting. It's not the reason that I got into this project in the first place, but it's something that really sort of took shape as I was working on it. And that's a lot of what I want to kind of share with you. Now, the basic idea I hope you will see in the course of our time together is that our experience of and our expectations of the Seder are divided between two very different modes and concepts of telling a story. And that those two modes are both valuable and meaningful, but for either of them to make sense, it's actually really helpful to separate them and see the ways in which they are distinct, both in style and in purpose. And one of the things that we will see is that one of those modes of storytelling shapes our expectations of the Seder, and the other is shaped almost the entire text of the Haggadah. So we come in with these expectations of what kind of what we're supposed to do in this ritual, and we have a script, right? This very well-known, sort of traditional script to guide us that does something entirely different, which I will say I always found very confusing and kind of frustrating. It was one of the things every year I'd come back to, like looking through this text and not only having a hard time tracking what it's doing, but searching in vain for the things that I knew it was supposed to do. And it doesn't seem to. And it turns out there are very good reasons for that. So we're going to look at these two different types of storytelling. And in doing so, one thing is, I want to help you to kind of make sense of the Haggadah as a text in a way that I have, again, always found elusive. And to be able to, when you come to the Haggadah, when you come to your Seder this year, as you're reading through these texts, not to be like, wait, what are we doing again? But to be able to say, oh, I see what these texts are doing, see what the sort of, how they fit together. I just understand what it is we're doing. So that's a part of it. And the second part is that kind of seeing that both, I hope, will encourage you to kind of think a little more broadly about what it is you might want to be, what goals you might have or might want to have for your Seder this year, and how the actual Haggadah text, instead of just being the kind of background music or the things that you read in between this kind of creative activities you've prepared, how the actual Haggadah text can be a part of that, and a part of that rethinking, and a part of really exploring what lessons the Seder holds for us. Okay, I am going to share a link to kind of a PDF of sources I'm going to be talking about. I'm also going to show most of them. I have a sort of a slideshow thing with many, not all of them, but if you want to have the the source sheet open, you can kind of also just look back at the sources. Also feel free to kind of just let me know if I've kind of gone through a source too quickly. One of the challenges of talking about sources that I've spent a lot of time with is my fear of my imagining that you're like, oh yeah, that one, I know that one, right? So if I rush through something too quickly, please just I'm happy to be sort of to pause and go through a little more slowly. Okay, so the first thing, what are our expectations of the Seder, of what we're supposed to do? So I think in various permutations, we understand the Seder as a time to tell a story, right? To narrate, to recount, to retell this dramatic saga, right? In some ways, I think we imagine that the Prince of Egypt, right, the movie, is kind of the ideal fulfillment of the mitzvah of telling the story of the Seder, right? It does it in a sort of colorful and gripping and exciting way. It makes it, you know, sort of with nice songs, and sort of really makes it sort of brings it to life. And you know, if you here, I'm now going to like share my little PowerPoint thing here. I think let's see how this works. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see. You can see that? Okay, oh, but that's not even the beginning. Okay, there you go. Okay, so this is the Maimonides version of what we're supposed to do at the Seder. I could have picked any one of 25 different commentators, since they all basically say the same thing. But this is just sort of Maimonides tends to take all these rabbinic texts and translate them into simple Hebrew. So he's always a good place to start. But he says it's a positive commandment, mitzvah aseh, to relate, to recount the miracles and wonders wrought for our ancestors in Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Right? To relate, lissaper, that word is going to be our key, lissaper, the miracles, the wonders done for our ancestors on the 15th of Nisan. So that's part one. And part two, even great sages are obligated, lissaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, to retell the Exodus from Egypt. So, and whoever recounts it at those events, the events that happened at greater length, right? Where the Rambam uses the word, sort of who ma'arich, from aroch, to go long. Other versions of the text suggest going sort of exploring it more deeply. But the more you do it, the greater length, greater depth, the better, is worthy of praise. Now, a couple of things about this. This probably kind of fits with more or less the sort of what comes to mind for most of us. The first thing is it's a mitzvah aseh shel Torah, right? It is that there are only two things that are mitzvah aseh shel Torah about the Seder. There are two mitzvot of the Seder: this and the eating of the matzah, which kind of is a stand-in for eating the Passover sacrifice. That's it. Right? Everything else in this ritual are vehicles for those two things. So this is the mitzvah. And if you notice in the first part, he says that we're telling about the miracles and wonders that were done for our ancestors. In the second part, he only says that what we need to be doing is retelling l'saper, is retelling the Exodus from Egypt. Now, the thing is that those aren't necessarily the same thing. In fact, I wager that if any of us, if you think about, well, what version of the story would you be telling if you were recounting the Exodus from Egypt? The wonders and the miracles would show up in your story, but probably at the end, right? If you have a 10-minute story, it's the last minute or two, as it is in Sefer Shemot, right? In Sefer Shemot, there are, this whole episode takes 12 chapters, and well, I guess in that case, because of the length of the descriptions of the plagues, so the last several chapters sort of are going to go into the plagues in great detail. But there's this whole other human drama that happens before any of that gets started. Whereas right at the beginning, he's talked about recounting the miracles and wonders, and that's it. But the second thing about this storytelling is that, first of all, this storytelling is something that even great sages have to do, which means that it's not just, it's not just, sort of story time with the kids. And I think one of the sort of striking things about this verb is that in other contexts, if you're telling a story as opposed to recounting the praises of God, if you're telling a story, it's more of a children's activity. But here it's not. Even great sages have to do it, which means that you're telling a story of sufficient complexity and depth that that a sage would do so. And it's a kind of retelling that can go on at greater and greater length. So you're telling a version of the story that that you could go into, or you can the kind of story that you could analyze and pull back layers of, right? You have a sense of the kind of story we're talking about. Now, you may recognize the terms of this version of this version, and because it comes from, well, we're going to see this in a second. Ignore the man behind the curtain for a second, and just on the left side, we recognize this from the story in the Haggadah, right? The story of the rabbis in Bnei Brak. And we always come to the story. People have all sorts of great theories about what were they really talking about in Bnei Brak, and why were they there, and what's sort of the secret meaning of the story. You can just see that, and that there's again. The introduction to the story really is where we see the Rambam's language, right? Even if we were all sages and wise and we knew the Torah, mitzvah aleinu, there's that word. It's a mitzvah. It's the only time that the Haggadah says something's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. Exactly that phrase, to recount the Exodus from Egypt, right? And kol hamarbe, the one who does it more or in greater depth, is to be praised. So we can see that the Rambam takes the language from the text of our Haggadah. Now, what I realized in going through this is that this story and its little introduction, and the notion that this is the mitzvah of the Seder, this is what we're doing in the Seder, shapes how we read the entire rest of the Haggadah, right? In every other text of the Haggadah, we are looking for and expecting the Haggadah to do this, because this is what we're supposed to do. The problem is this text in the Haggadah is the only text anywhere in rabbinic literature to use that verb to talk about the Exodus. There's no other. There's no biblical text that talks about being misaper, right? About recounting the Exodus in any form. There's no rabbinic text that talks about it. It is only this text in the Haggadah. Now, but beyond that, and here's where we get into, I get into a little bit of like sort of academic of kind of reconstructing the history of these texts. This text about the rabbis from Bnei Brak is not in most early records of the Haggadah text that we have, meaning all of the versions of the Haggadah from Eretz Yisrael, many of which were sort of versions of which were found in the Cairo Geniza. None of them have this story. Earlier versions of Babylonian Haggadot don't have this story. Only the kind of latest versions of the Babylonian Haggadah texts have the story. And I just gave two examples. It's kind of cool to see. You can see here in this is just a printing of the Sidur of Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon was from the 10th century, one of the most influential Gaonim in Babylonia, and one of the two Babylonian Gaonim to write out and send to the diaspora, basically, collections of prayer texts and liturgy texts. And he's one of the early records we have of the Haggadah. And here he has, right, you have Avadim Hayinu Lefarav Mitzrayim, etc., etc., etc. He goes right from Avadim Hayinu, and if we hadn't been freed, if they hadn't been freed, then we would still be slaves, etc. Right? He goes straight to the 4 children. Nothing in between. Bnei Brak's not there. The little Mishnah about talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim at night and at night isn't there. Straight to the 4 children. Here, this is just, I have this here because it's fun. You have to look a little carefully, but this is how it is when we you find this is a Geniza fragment, and you can imagine the sort of the early scholars kind of sifting through these vast mountains of pieces of parchment from all sorts of different types of texts and also different eras, all collected in this kind of essentially sacred trash bin in the synagogue in Cairo. And you're fishing through, you're looking at like marriage contract and agreements about cattle, and then you come across a little piece of parchment like this, where you can see at the beginning, Ve'otanu hotzi misham, which is the end of the earlier version of Avadim Hayinu. And right after that, right here at the top, Keneged Arba'a blank, right, Dibra Torah, which is the beginning of the 4 children. Right, and enough of these little fragments, and you figure out that Haggadot of the Eretz Yisrael tradition did not have this section. Now, why is that? What's the snoop about that? Well, this story is only in the Haggadah, and it appears pretty late in the Haggadah, but there is a related story in the Tosefta. The Tosefta is without getting into the details, a collection of teachings that was compiled around the same time as the Mishnah. So the Tosefta is a very early text from the early 3rd century. And there's a story in the Tosefta, story about Rabban Gamliel and the elders reclining in the house of Baitus ben Zonin in Lod. Right? And they were occupied studying the laws of Pesach all that night, meaning the night of the Seder. Right? Until the cock crowed, until dawn, and then they went to daven. Now, most commentaries on the Haggadah and sort of most, and there's so many both commentaries on it and books about the history of the Haggadah. People note, oh, there are these two similar stories. Oh, they're similar and they're similar. You can see how people would imagine they're different stories because they feature different rabbis and they are different places. But the similarities are far more significant. Just the fact that there are these two stories, and there are no other similar stories. There are two stories of a group of rabbis gathered at somebody's house in a particular place, talking all night, specifically on Pesach, until dawn. Already, I would be ready to tell you these are not these are not like two independent stories. Right? One of these stories is based on the other. If you didn't believe me, here is the introduction to our Haggadah story, right? Afilu, even if we're all sages, wise, etc. Here's the introduction to the Tosefta story. You have to study the laws of Pesach all night, even if it's just you and your child, even just you by yourself, even if it's just you and your student. So the structure, the exact same structure makes clear that one of these stories is based on the other. Now, one of them is from the 3rd century, and one of them first appears in the 9th century. So I think our sort of the order of operations, I think, is pretty clear. I can tell you that while this Tosefta story is from the 3rd century, the Tosefta as a text didn't get to Babylonia until at least the 6th century. And I'm going to tell you that if 9th century Haggadah in Babylonia didn't have this story and 10th century Haggadah did, it was probably written sometime around then. Now, that means two things. Number one, well, the first thing is that this story in the Haggadah is not actually a story from the 2nd century about those 5 rabbis. It's a story from the 9th century that is adapting a much earlier story. But I also know now why this text says so uncharacteristically, mitzvah aleinu l'saper b'tei Mitzrayim, that it is a mitzvah to tell the story, because it's adapted from an earlier text that was talking about an obligation, right? An obligation to do something else, to study halacha, right? But that language of obligation kind of was already in there. It also means this story, the story about the 5 rabbis in Bnei Brak, was really composed in the 9th or 10th century in Babylonia and included in the Haggadah. That means that the entire rest of Magid, everything else we think of as the sort of the core of the Haggadah, including the later editions like Dayenu, were all written before this story. And that means when they were all written, there was no such thing as l'saper b'yetziat Mitzrayim. That phrase hadn't been coined yet. So the expectation that all of the rest of the text of Magid are doing sipur yetziat Mitzrayim turns out not to make any sense, because that's not how texts before this story talked about it. So how did they talk about it? That's where we're going to go next. But I want to pause for any questions or comments or anything before we shift to how the rest of the Haggadah really thinks about this mitzvah. So I'll stop my share for a minute. If anybody has either a thought or a question so far, you're also welcome to kind of pop questions into the chat as we go along, and I can kind of look in and respond to them when we come to that.
I have a question.
All right.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the authors of the Haggadah did not have the conceptual framework of telling the story. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, telling the story in this kind of like tell an extended narrative way, right? They had a very
Okay, but they did have the concept of telling in some way, because that's from the Torah.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Right. Okay. So let's look at the conception that they did have. And for that, we're going to go back to my little PowerPoint thing here. Okay. The conception they did have really is best summed up in this verse from Exodus chapter 13, right? V'higadata lebincha bayom hahu lemor, right? You will explain to your child on that day, the day of Pesach, saying, Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. This meaning the observance of Passover, is because of what Adonai did for me when I went free from Egypt. Now, what is the word v'higadata? V'higadata, or magid, is a word that, and I had like have a whole kind of like a series of examples of this, but this is just this verse from Genesis 41 is just kind of one sample, right, where Paro explains to Yosef about his dreams, and Yosef says, "Oh, God, what God is planning to do, higid leFaro. God has informed Paro." And in so many different examples, lahagid is to tell, to inform, to instruct, right? To convey, usually in a concise and direct way, an instruction that in general carries with it some expectations for what that person will do. So Mordechai hears about the plot against Achashverosh, and he tells Esther, who then goes and reports that, and the plot is stopped. So at its most basic level, Lahagid is instruct, to tell you need to tell your children about this, right? In a kind of direct and didactic way. Now, what is it that you're supposed to tell them? And this is, if you think about it, this is now Exodus 13. There's been this whole dramatic narrative, right, about those 12 chapters with all of the details and dramas. But the only thing that the parent is supposed to tell the child in V'higadata is, this is because of what Adonai did for me. The only thing I need to tell you, child, is about what God did for me, what God did for us. And the whole midrash of the 4 children is based on the 4 places where the Torah instructs parents to tell their children about the Exodus. And if you look at those 4 places, you notice a pattern. Right? Here are the first and the third. The first 3 are in Exodus 12 and 13, right at the end of the big dramatic narrative. Right? And the first one, child asks, "What's this avodah? What's this ritual? The ritual of the Paschal sacrifice?" And you, the parent, shall say, right? It's because Adonai passed over our houses when smiting the Egyptians and saved us. Again, there's all this 12 chapters of material, but the only thing the parent says is, here's what God did for us in saving us. And in chapter 13, something similar. The child asks, what does this mean? Mazot, right? You know that the question of the simple child, right? The answer is remarkably parallel. With a mighty hand, Adonai brought us out from Egypt. Right? Paro refused to let us go. Adonai slew every firstborn in Egypt, right? And therefore, I do serve God in these various ways. There's detail, but the only detail is about what precisely God did for us, not about any of the rest of the story. And that is a very, very different kind of telling. It's a different kind of telling with a different kind of goal. So what is that goal then? What is the point of and what is the obligation that comes with that comes with telling them this is what of telling our children about what God did for us? So here, right, is the first kind of text that we use to answer the question. The child asks the 4 questions, like, what is this all about? And we answer with this, Avadim hayinu lefarov Mitzrayim. We were slaves. Vayotziena Adonai Eloheinu misham. God took us out of there. Biyad chazakah, bizro nutuyah, with a strong hand and outstretched arm. Now, if you're looking for the Prince of Egypt, this one sentence, very disappointing. Kind of leaves you flat. Knew that's it, right? There's so many commentators that try to like, well, this isn't really the answer. This is just the introduction. This is just like a frame, and then we're going to fill in all the details, which of course we're not. But in fact, this was intended as an answer. Now, we'll see that the Haggadah actually has 4 separate answers to the question, which are different in subtle but important ways. But first, I want you to see that this is the fourth verse, the 4th answer to explanation to a child from the one from the book of Deuteronomy, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But I want you to understand that this was meant as an answer to the question. The child asks, and you tell them, we were slaves, and God brought us out with a mighty hand. What is the moral of the story? Well, it tells us. If God had not brought us out of Mitzrayim, we and our children and our children's children would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. I always found this to be a very weird claim, right? Like, what do you mean we'd all still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt? I mean, there's no Pharaoh in Egypt anymore. I mean, and there wasn't, thousands of years ago either. What is this claim supposed to mean? Oh, the claim, whatever you, however you want to understand exactly what would have happened to us, what the Torah and what the Haggadah, what Magid wants you to know is that you can't think of God saving us from Egypt as something that happened to them back then, as something long ago, dusty, forgotten. You have to feel like you, no matter how many generations have passed, that you owe where you are now and what you have now to the fact that God saved us. That if not for God having done that, then wherever we were now, we would not be here and have what we have. In other words, the point of Magid is to tell you, the child, about the wonders that God did for us, so that you understand, that you really feel that you and I, we personally owe our place in the world and our place in this Jewish community, in this people of Israel, directly to God, to God's acts. Right? I'm gonna wait. Oh, I had something in here. I had something in here that apparently did not get saved. No picture. No, I lost my picture.
Can I make a comment while you're looking, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
So, I find it very difficult to feel like we owe everything, or I owe everything I have to Yitziat Mitzrayim simply. In other words, to say, God brought us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and so now all of my life is because of that. And that I would have still been a slave even now had that not happened. So I think you're heading there. I'm not sure, but I want to raise that point. I want to raise that point anyway, because I think that sometimes we see that language in the Haggadah and we think we're supposed to be religiously moved and transformed by it. And I'm not sure that's what the rabbis who constructed the Haggadah had in mind.
So, am I going to find this picture? Where am I going to find it? Is my picture here? No. Darn it. All right, I may have lost my picture. Not permanently, but oh, I know where it is. Here it is. Okay. This, can you see this? Can you all see the picture?
No, you have to stop the share and then.
Oh, I have to stop the share and redo it. Okay. Stop share, and now share again, and this time here. Picture. Okay. This is 23-year-old Josh, spending a year working in the former Soviet Union. And this is actually, I had the opportunity to visit the shtetl in Ukraine, where my great-grandparents had lived, and from which they left at the beginning of the turn of the 20th century. And here I'm visiting, and they rarely have a foreigner visiting. So they brought out all of the school kids. I got to meet with all the school kids, and talk to them. And and one of the kids asked me, and I feel like it breaks my heart even like now when I kind of think back to it. I said, well, are you are you glad that your ancestors sort of left and went to America and didn't stay here? And I mean, the first level, like, I mean, none of the things I could explain to these kids who've grown up in this little town. But aside from expecting that if my ancestors had stayed there, they would not have still been alive. But even kind of setting that aside, if you could, sort of looking around at this kind of very sort of poor and difficult and kind of barren place, I didn't even know how to begin to talk to them about how much of a difference it made for me. And I think of this because going to that village, going to that shtetl, forced me to really think about, well, if my grandparents hadn't left Ukraine, it's hard to know what would have happened, although one can definitely imagine. I'm pretty sure that whatever I feel like I have in the world and things that I and the opportunities that I have and the gifts that I have here would not have been possible, right? All of that would not have happened if not for that choice that my great-grandparents made. Now, that's not to say, right? That's different than saying, I think, and here's where I think it's important to kind of rethink. It's not to say that that is the sole cause for everything that that has happened since then. And so there are many causes for everything. However, I think I can always look back on that moment, that turning point, that moment in history, and the choices that my ancestors made in that moment, as opening up a path that made everything that came afterwards possible. And it left me feeling in a different way than I ever had before, a sense of responsibility to them, a sense of responsibility to uphold the things that they believed in and cared about, and to and a kind of sense of allegiance to that Jewish identity and to the Jewish identity they brought with them and they built here. So I think that I share that because I think that that is the sense in which we're supposed to sort of think about this as if it happened to us. Not that it's the only thing that happened to us, not that everything that we experience is due to that in some kind of like exclusive way, but if you can imagine that had the Exodus not happened, then the people of Israel as it came to being and as it has become over the generations, simply would not have gotten started in that way. I think we can see ourselves, as all kind of having grown out of that seed. And the point of thinking of it that way is not simply to be like, whoa. It's that experience brings with it a sense of responsibility, a sense of obligation to God, a sense of being in sort of owing kind of both gratitude and service to God in kind of an ongoing way, and to kind of carrying that torch and that tradition. I want to look at one more text that really kind of talks in this vein, and that I think is actually a text that is powerful and underappreciated in the Haggadah. And as we look at this text, right, the text of Arami Obed Avi, right, my father was a wandering Aramean, or however you choose to translate it, that is kind of one of the centerpieces of the Haggadah. As we look at this, I want you to sort of appreciate that there are many texts across Tanakh, across the Bible, that go and that in some sense recap the events of the Exodus. But they don't actually retell the Exodus in anything like the way we imagine. What they're doing is they are primarily doing two things. They talk about Israel's need, about our being in its lowliness and a state of oppression, and they talk about God's wonders. Right? They're lists of the many wonders that God did on our behalf. Right? If you think about the song Dayenu, right? And if you're thinking about Dayenu, if you think that what we're saying is, if you'd only done this for us and not these other things, that would have been enough for us, it feels ridiculous. Because of course it wouldn't have been. If you'd taken us halfway into the desert and then left us there, that would have been enough for us. Awesome. But that's not actually the purpose of any of these lists. The purpose, what the lists are conveying, what that song tries to convey, is each one of these acts, each one of these miracles is enough to be worthy of praise, of gratitude, and even of a sense of indebtedness. Each one in itself is a great wonder that should inspire awe. Right? Taken all together, all in this chain, it should blow your mind. And so each of them frames it a little differently. Each of these kind of recountings of God's deeds has a slightly different purpose, but they're all focused on God's deeds, not on retelling the rest of the story. And their goal is to inspire, inspire loyalty to and a sense of connectedness, of connection to God. But the one that is the centerpiece of the Haggadah is this one. Now, the context for this text is really important. This is the text that if you were an Israelite in the land of Israel in the sort of centuries after the conquest of the land, and after the Israelites were settled in the land and the temple was built, right? In those centuries, you would, around Shavuot, gather the first fruits of your land, and you would bring them as a gift as a gift, as a gift of thanks to the temple. Basically, you would take the fruit of the land and you would bring them to God and say, God, here is the fruit of the land that you gave me. And in this act, I'm acknowledging the specialness of the very fact that I'm here able to enjoy it and to grow it and to eat it. And this is the text that the Israelites would recite at the temple. My father was a wandering fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt in small numbers and dwelt there. There, he became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor on us. We cried to Adonai, God of our ancestors. Adonai heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Adonai freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand and outstretched arm, power, and signs and wonders. So there are four little pieces, four verses here. My ancestor went down to Egypt and became a great nation there. The Egyptians oppressed us and imposed labor on us. We cried out to Adonai. We pleaded for help, and God answered our call with miracles. And actually, the text goes on to trace the miracle, to talk about bringing us through the desert and ultimately to the land of Israel. You see, again, this is focused on the two elements: our suffering and God's wonders and God's aid. This one focuses a little more on going down and the experience of the experience of being oppressed before it gets to and specifically to our crying out and God answering us. What you need to think about is the context. I'm an Israelite standing in the temple, right? If I'm standing in the temple in the land of Israel, it means that I'm already in a generation that has escaped those dangers, that's crossed the desert, right? The land has been conquered. We have settled in it successfully. We've built this temple. We're now living the life. And essentially, what we're saying when we bring the first fruits to the temple is, this is the life that our ancestors dreamt about. All through their exile and their suffering, this is the life this is what they endured for. This is what kept them going. The dream of their descendants one day being able to do this. And here I am doing it. And it's kind of unbelievable. There is an amazing gospel song that talks about that. Whose sort of like chorus line is, "We are our grandparents' dreams." We are what we are experiencing is the reason that our grandparents went through all of the things that they went through, whether it was sort of enduring centuries of hardships in different places in the world, whether it was traveling great distances at great risk, to find a better life, if we are, to the extent that we are living that life, this recitation is a moment of recognition of we have what our ancestors dreamed of. And I think that is meant to be both an inspiration, kind of an emotional, like, what we have is amazing. The blessings that we have, the ones that we, right, the ones that we so easily take for granted. This is where I was thinking so much about the angst that I heard this week around, which is the angst which is very real about things that are happening in this country, and concerns about our place, and about, and the threats against Jews always take on the echoes of threats of earlier generations. But we forget in getting kind of all caught up in that we have blessings here that Jews of in other years, other generations, other places never had. And I think that kind of, like, looking back and saying, if God hadn't brought us out, we wouldn't be here. Is supposed to really inspire in us a sense of, or maybe rekindle in us a sense of wonder that we are here, wherever the here is that we are in this moment. That, like, we are here, we have come through so many things, and there's supposed to be a wonder in that, a sense of amazement, and once again, a sense of responsibility, that sense that however long the chain has been from the beginnings of the nation of Israel until us, however many links it has been passed down, that sort of gift has been placed into our hands. Like, the sense that for us to really feel what it means to be the inheritors of that tradition, we have to feel kind of like the gift was given to us, right? Because that's, and that, I think, is the point I want to kind of end on for tonight, which is that the story that the Haggadah is really telling, the one that it's pleading for us to really feel, is not, right? It's not remember what it was like to suffer, not remember how we suffered. It's remember what it felt like to be freed. Remember what freedom felt like in the first moments that we had it. Imagine, if you will, not imagine being in Egypt, but imagine being among the Israelites standing on the shore of the sea. That first really having that, the first moment of that real awareness of freedom from oppression washing over you, if you will. And the intensity of that sense of relief, that sense of joy. And if you think about the people on the shore of that sea, right, in that moment of knowing, of tasting freedom for the first time, what did they do? They sang. And they didn't sing because they were commanded to sing, and they didn't sing because it was time. They sang because they couldn't help it, because they needed to sing. Because when they were so filled by that experience, they needed to let out that joy. And I will, and it is, it's great to just notice that, you know, we say Hallel at the Seder. We mostly say it after the meal. We say a little bit of it before the meal. And largely that's because on this night, if you feel that sense of that, you're really feeling that sense of that experience of freedom, like the people on the shore of the sea, you need to sing. The songs can't wait till after we've eaten, right? And I think that is in large part that is the framing of, I want you to convey to your children, to your communities, to your families, to yourself. Like, what is it to really feel like freedom and all that goes with it is a gift that was given personally to you. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Have thoughts, questions. Yeah, please.
Perhaps I'm extrapolating too much, and I feel that what I'm hearing is sort of curious, comforting, and somewhat shocking, that what you're saying is that the point of this is to remind us that we're not alone out here, that there's some greater power, was or is, not defining what that is, but it's just a reminder of Hashem power in the universe.
I think maybe more specifically to try to feel like you're personally sort of touched and helped by that power. Right, that
but not just touched, but that there's something that does the touching, or some.
Look, I mean, yes, every Jewish, you know, any Jewish ritual, and certainly one like this, is going to be is about trying to imagine and enrich our experience of being in relationship to God. And you don't have to sort of, this is where I think people sometimes get caught up in needing to know exactly what God is in order to talk about that. And I really don't think that, but I think that it is essential to be willing to think about and to feel and to seek out a sense of connectedness, a sense of having been aided, guided, inspired by that connection. And that's hard for sure. But I will say that to the extent that that's the goal of the Seder, I get why it's something that you need to do every year.
I
Right, 'cause-
personally buy it and believe it. I just find it somewhat both comforting and shocking to hear you say that. That's all I'm saying.
Really, you find it shocking to hear me say that?
I don't know.
That's so that is certainly interesting to me, because for me, like, that is I mean, look, I agree with you that it is, like, in some sense, I started by saying that this notion that we're going to, like, retell the whole story, and then with all of its dramatic ups and downs, right, is a later kind of layer to this ritual that isn't reflected in the Haggadah text. I think there are a variety of reasons why both why that new understanding was kind of introduced, and also why it became the dominant kind of framework. And one of them is that that telling the human story is in some sense easier for everyone to relate to, right? I mean, but it is less the story that certainly the rabbis would have said that we need to hear, right? Because one last just little thing that is that just goes unnoticed in the when we talk about the four children, the wise child asks, what are the laws and the, what are the laws and the statutes and blah, 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 that the Lord has commanded us? By which the question, which comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, the question means, what's the reason for them, or what's the reason that we do them, right? Why are we committed to observing these laws, right? And the answer in the Torah, the answer in the Haggadah is, oh, it's because of the, in answer you teach him what the laws are, right? Yes, what are the laws? You tell him the laws. You tell him the laws of Pesach, right? Which makes you think that the question he was asking, not only was it about, that you think that he was asking about what are the laws, but that he's specifically asking about Pesach. But in the Torah, he wasn't. In the Torah, the question is about all of the laws and the statutes and the practices. And the child in Torah asks, what's the base? Why do we do all of the mitzvot? Why do we do all, like, what's the basis for this entire system of serving God through mitzvot? And the answer to that question is, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God brought us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. In other words, the Exodus is starting point for our commitment to the whole system of Torah mitzvot. All, right, comes back to this moment of God bringing us to freedom, God giving us an identity as a nation, as a people, an identity that we still hold on to. against all odds, right? The extent to which being the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and our connection to the state of Israel are all products of this shared identity that has been resilient and sort of and enriched and deepened over 3,000 years. If we look to the moment of its creation, right, and be thinking of God as having as the one who kind of shaped and created that identity, who we are and how we see ourselves and our place in the world, all kind of in a sense grow from that. That's the story. Okay. I hope that I hope this that this push you to kind of think a little bit differently about this text, about this ritual. When we gather next in a few weeks' time, right? We're going to look a little more concretely at the text of the Haggadah. We'll go through, and one of the things we'll see is that as you go through the Haggadah with this kind of lens in mind, a lot of things start to fit together in a new kind of way, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about the Haggadah as a text and how we kind of use and relate to this text that we recite in the course of this ritual. And we'll get a chance to look at the pages of my Haggadah and talk about the sort of the process and the challenges of kind of crafting a ritual text.
I wonder if, as we're closing out, if people have specific questions about how to use the Haggadah to tell the story, if they might want to put them in the chat, and then
That'd be great. And then
Cahan will have something to work off of. We'll save them so we can get him the questions. I have a question for starters, so I'll stick it in the chat, which is knowing that many of us at the Seder are less interested in God and less sure of any sort of belief in God, but still want to have a wonderful, meaningful Seder. How might the Haggadah be useful in shaping a meaningful experience, if at all?
Great.
So I'll stick that in the chat.
And all right. Well,
all right. It seems like not much is coming in. So there's a little bit. I'm going to lower my hand so as not to confuse. So thank you, Rabbi Cahan, and thanks to people for coming. And we'll see next time what happens when we take a look inside the Haggadah and think about how we tell the story, and think again about really what is the story that we're telling. And maybe I'll ask other provocative questions, or maybe I won't. But thank you for coming and
all right,
meeting
thank you so much.
friends. And thank you so much, Rabbi Cahan, for coming and joining us tonight on Zoom.
All right, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
good
you,
night.
Rabbi.